Hello everyone, and welcome to this VCE EAL professional learning session preparing students for the VCE EAL exam. My name is David. I'm the professional learning coordinator at VCE EAL, and I'd like to welcome you all here today. Before we start, a couple of technical housekeeping matters. During the presentations at the start, if you could keep yourself muted during this time to eliminate any background noise, that'd be great. And then later on, when we go into breakout rooms, you'll be able to turn your microphones on and your videos on. If you have any technical questions, something's not working for you, please put them in the chat function and we'll deal with that individually. We'll also have a little bit of time after the presentations for Q&A. So if you have any questions that you have, you can also put them in the chat function as well. If you have any big dramas and you drop out, you can also email VCE EAL at victeseal.vic.edu.au to talk to Carly about getting back into the session. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we meet on today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to extend this acknowledgement to the lands on which you join us from today. I would also like to acknowledge the rich lessons that we as educators can learn from Aboriginal peoples who have created and maintained a link through language which has lasted tens of thousands of years. I'd like to now introduce the presenters that we are very fortunate to have today. Three very experienced EAL teachers who are volunteering their time to, I suppose, give to the wider Victorian EAL community. They are Naomi Weiler, who is the EAL Unit 1 to 4 Coordinator and Gifted Learners Leader at St Francis Xavier College. Welcome, Naomi.
Hi, thank you.
Stephanie Georgiou, English and EAL teacher at McKinnon Secondary College. Welcome, Stephanie.
Hello, everyone.
And Maria Papasotiriou, who is the head of EAL at Wellington Secondary College. Welcome, Maria.
Hi, everyone.
So the way the session will work today is that there'll be 3 presentations. Each will be 15 minutes each. The presentations will be based on the sections of the exam. So Naomi will be presenting on section A, Stephanie will be presenting on section B, and Maria will be presenting on section C. After those 3 presentations, we'll have a short amount of Q&A in which you can ask them questions. If you have questions for specific presenters, please put their name in brackets after the question. That'd be really, really helpful. After the presentations and the Q&A, we'll then go into small breakout rooms, which will be randomly allocated of groups of about 5. Where you'll have a chance to also talk about how you are preparing students for the exam and to, I suppose, share practice with other teachers. Finally, we also asked you some poll questions, which I'll just read now. I'm going to end polling. So we've introduced ourselves, so it's good to know who's in the room. I'll just share the results. So the first question was, what is your teaching context? So 83% of you are in standalone VCE EAL classrooms. 21% are in EAL students within a mainstream English classroom. And that's a bit of a typo, sorry, that last. English classrooms are 3%, so English teachers, okay. Which section of the exam do you feel the students in your class will perform best on? 55% said listening to texts, 28% said analytical interpretation of a text, and 17% said section C, argument and persuasive language. Which section of the exam do you feel the students in your class need the most support with? 10% said listening to texts, 48% said analytical interpretation of a text, and 41% said argument and persuasive language. How do you feel about the task of helping students to prepare for the exam? 17% of us are nervous, 14% are excited, 7% are relaxed, and 14% are confident, and 48% are all of the above. Yes, it's often a mixture of emotions at this time of year, I'm sure. So I'll stop sharing those results. thanks for participating in that poll, and it's good to know who's in the room. Okay, so that's it for the introduction. I'll now hand over to Naomi for her presentation on section A. Thanks, Naomi.
No worries. All right, so I'm presenting on section A, and it's possibly one of my favorite sections. And the reason why I love this section is it's the only one that the mainstreamers don't do. And it's also a great opportunity for kids with different kind of traits and skills to really do very well in this section. And as I can see from the poll, a lot of us think that our kids are going to do very well in this section, which is great. So what I'm going to do with this presentation is I'm going to start off by talking about some core exam information very briefly, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of strategies that I tend to use within the classroom that have proven to be quite successful. So it's really important to remember that the listening task takes about 40 minutes and it is 20% of the overall exam. So it is the first section that they have to do. So it is one section that you probably want to make sure that you spend a lot of time making sure they feel really confident with, so that when they go in, they feel like they're ready for it. And when they go into the exam, they already kind of feel like they've got things under control. I will say this as well, make sure that you know the room that the kids are going to be in, because last year I was put into a room that didn't have any form of sound, and that was quite chaotic for a little bit. The VCAR directive and anything that within the study design is our first place that we need to start. The VCAR directive tells us exactly what we need to be looking at within this section and tells us the skills and knowledge our kids should be showing within the exam. When it comes to the key skills and knowledge, I tend to explicitly teach these, and then I use the key skills and knowledge as a checklist for my kids. I get them to write down each one of these and make sure, oh, so part of the slide is appearing cut off for some people. Hold on a second.
We'll handle that in the background, Naomi, no worries.
Yeah, no worries, you got it? Okay, excellent, thank you. So I make sure that the kids actually take each one of these and turn this into a checklist when we begin revision. So they write it down as a list, and then they'll go through and tick off what they feel like they already know. If there is a section that they don't feel really confident with, then we go back over that as a class. One core area I find kids really struggle with, and particularly with my kiddos, is the relationship between the speakers and their audience. I feel that this is one area that we all really need to focus on, because not only are they listening to content, but they also need to be thinking about paralinguistics, and then they also need to find a way to describe how these people work together. So I actually sit there with a lot of time and go through this with them. I actually have teachers come into the room that I've staged, and we have conversations in front of them. And sometimes it's hostile kind of conversations, so the kids can learn to see, hear, and identify the different types of relationships. And afterwards, the kids will be like, okay, this is the tone word I'm thinking of. This is how I would describe this relationship. And it's a great place to start talking about how relationships work together. It's also important to note that there are 3 core types of questions. We have our classic comprehension questions, which are about recalling information. There's comprehension questions that require students to consider the implications and infer meaning, which I would say is probably one of the most challenging parts for our EAL students. And then the other part is about deliverance, so how the information is going to be delivered. So some of the questions will look like these, and these have been taken from the 2019 VCAR exam. What you'll notice is with these questions is that they usually outline a number. They often come with a certain number of lines and mark schemes, which indicate exactly how much time they should be spending on each question, but also kind of indicate whether it's a one-word kind of response or a sentence response. Continuing with that, we also have tables and we have multiple choice, including other kind of like types of multiple choice. The tables tend to require people to identify what the speaker's attitudes or beliefs are on a certain kind of topic, the advantages or disadvantages of an idea, what they might be feeling about a certain situation, or it might ask people to consider to provide an example or a quotation to validate a particular opinion. The multiple choice questions often provide a series of questions or statements, or answers that perhaps seem quite similar, and kids need to go through and choose what they think is the most appropriate or most correct response. And these are some of the tables here. It's important to note the marking schemes as well. Some of these tables are actually quite comprehensive and they require kids to spend a large amount of time here. I know I've done a couple of sample pieces where kids have actually spent something like, half the time in that section because it was worth 10 marks. And it's important that they understand that if a section is worth more, they do need to spend more time there. This section, this slide needs to become your best friend if it isn't already. On this whole website on VCAR, you have got audio clips, you have got the assessor reports, and the kids should be downloading all of this and having this on their computers. So that's the exam kind of stuff. Now we're going to move on to talking about exam preparation strategies. Now obviously time is the essence here, so I am going to move through it quite quickly. So if there are any questions, just ask me at the end. I kind of think about what I need my kids to know, and the first thing they need to know is how to use time. We are so fortunate that we have the 15 minutes reading time, and I teach my kids to use that to their advantage. I get them to read section B, the questions first, then section C, and then go back to section A, so that they can read the questions that they're going to be asked, and it can be quite predictive. They can work out what words they maybe don't know, maybe work out words that they need to look in the dictionary, maybe kind of have a bit of an understanding of the types of questions that are going to be asked for that section. I also provide a class with a scaffold on how to use time, and I will actually write a table with them of how I want them to use their minutes. Because it has a great sense of time allotments, it's actually quite useful to teach them to target their time. I encourage my students, for example, to write a lot of notes in the first listening of the text and really focus on the comprehension kind of questions and the facts. In the second listening, I'm more interested in them focusing on paralinguistics, looking more at the deliverance, looking at the relationships, the things that probably require a second reading to fully understand. And it's also important to note that once they finish answering these questions after the second recording, they can start the exam. So if they finish early, that's fine. They can start one of the first sections. I really focus on reading with my kiddos. I model a lot of reading of the questions and how to annotate the background information for meaning. It's important that they understand what the purpose is of that conversation. I believe there was a question only last year, or maybe it was the year before, where it asked you what the purpose was of that particular conversation. And that will be there in the background information. I also provide them with a list of keywords that are present in questions, and I'll also spend a decent amount of time defining what those keywords actually mean in regards to the exam and into English. Because we find that when we go into our dictionaries, the definition, whilst it is literal, it probably feels really like separate from our subject. So it's important that they understand what the word means in the context of the task. With that, I will also then provide questions where you see that vocabulary, that definition, and put it all together so that they can see, for example, what does inference mean? And then I might put what the actual definition is within our context, and then a question that is about inference or how to infer meaning. I provide numerous sample questions, and I might randomly pop one up at the beginning of the lesson or at the end of the lesson just so they can see the questions, and we'll annotate together what the question is actually asking. I also encourage students when we're preparing for exams to highlight keywords and use their dictionaries when they become lost. By highlighting keywords, it reinforces that they understand where the action is within the question. So this is an example of some of the work from my kids' workbooks. And you'll notice here, this is all of our preparation work. The kids are highlighting keywords, they're annotating. The really, really messy one down below is actually my one. I'm not very good with my stylus yet, so I apologize. But you see, we'll go through and we annotate and we make sure that we understand what is being asked of us. And by keeping it all online as well, it's really useful for them to continuously go back. In terms of like the writing kind of side of things as well, I make sure that we spend a lot of time establishing key note taking kind of guides. I use a lot of history note kind of styles, but I might use things that are maybe more hip when the kids recommend something that's quite good for shorthand in terms of text speak. I get students to write their notes with the questions in mind as well. So when they're writing their notes on the side of their exam, I make sure that they're trying to put it in categories as they're going through. Now, obviously, stronger kids will be able to do that easier, whereas weaker kids will probably just want to be writing like crazy. And lastly, I make sure I use targeted listening strategies. So for example, our first listening tends to be always about comprehension of fact, and our second listening is more about relationship. And as we prepare for exams, we make sure we target that together. So what I try to do as well is I try and make sure that our writing is always sticking to these 3 C's. It is always really controlled, it is concise, and it's succinct. You want to make sure that the kids fully understand that what they're responding to is quite simplistic in terms of what you need to answer with. You don't need to be going into great detail, and in fact, when you do go into great detail, you're probably wasting a little bit of time. And using the marking scheme is really great at guiding that. So things that I think are really, really important in preparation for the exam, and then I'll wrap this up, is to make sure that you recover and explicitly teach paralinguistic elements. If you need it, Google paralinguistic vocab into Google. There will be tables that come up. Keep it simple, but make sure they understand it. Provide vocabulary that can be used to discuss the relationship between speakers, from really hostile to really friendly. Make it even on a gradient. Model response questions and also model annotation with EAL students. I find particularly with my kiddos, they really engage when they see me do it. Whereas if I tell them how to do it, they find it really hard. It's that modeling, which is part of one of those key strategies. Provide consistent listening tasks. I do at least 1 a week, and I have been continuously doing this throughout the year, so it's not a shock to the system. They get a bit over it, but it's definitely worth it. Practice. Kids have to practice listening, reading, and writing for this section. And they need to be listening as much as possible. You can make it a target practice session. You can make it that you're just focusing on writing 1 lesson, or you maybe just focusing on listening. I know sometimes I'll just put a listening task up and we will just listen, stop, discuss, listen, stop, discuss. And that's enough in terms of practice. So it's a fantastic section. I think it's really awesome. Begin by looking at the VCAR resources and go from there. So, I think I'm all good.
Thank you very much, Naomi, for such an informative presentation and lots of good strategies there, including I've noted down the 3 C's, which I think is a really useful way to think about it. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'll now invite, and if you have any questions for Naomi or any of the presenters, feel free to put them in the chat function. Just put in brackets who you'd like to direct the question to. Stephanie, if you'd like to share your screen now.
Hello everyone, I'm Stephanie Georgiou, really pleased to be here to discuss preparing for section B of the exam, which is analytical text response writing. So what is required, this has come from the VCAR website, so students are required to write an essay, an analytical interpretation to one of the texts on list 1 or the EAL designated text in list 2. And the responses should be using a lot of examples and explanation from the text. If the students have been studying poems or short stories, then the advice from VCAR is to refer to at least 2 of the poems or 2 of the stories in close detail. The students are required to demonstrate deep knowledge and understanding of the events, the ideas, the values presented in the text in relation very specifically to the prompt that's been provided to them in the exam. So they're also required to adopt an academic writing style, which we'll talk about in the presentation. And language accuracy seems to be, is a large focus of the response as well. Responses need to be in a logical order and logically expressed. This is basically the criteria that the examiner is looking for. It's just summarised here for you. The mark allocation I've put up here for all of us, just as a reminder to what we are trying to get the students to work towards. Basically, anecdotally, in my experience, okay, students are wanting to go to university, they're wanting to get a study score of 30. Anecdotally, they really need to be getting around a 7, I guess, in this section. And when they're hitting 7s, they're hitting the constructing language, how the authors construct meaning within their texts, and how they build the world of their text to add meaning to the reader and the audience's perceptions. So it's often the missing piece, I guess, for some students. If they're not getting a 7 out of 10 for their response in section B, it's because they haven't discussed things like meta-language, they haven't discussed or put the author's name inside the essay, they haven't created a relevant response to the text. So, yes, next. If students are sort of working, I know a lot of you have students who are challenged. They find English challenging. If they can write an essay that has, reference to the text, perhaps retells the story as opposed to targeting the prompt, they're looking at a 5. Or below. So we really want to avoid students retelling the text, and the strategies that I'm about to provide are in aid of helping students avoid retelling and to start analysing. So the examination advice from 2019, what I've done for us is sort of bolded and underlined the key points that we should really be taking away to build the skills of our students. And the presentation that follows has strategies that targets all of these bolded areas that I've highlighted here. So ideally, we're getting kids, when they get their prompt, they're brainstorming all the keywords, and they're also creating a well-planned response. So that means within the exam, they need to dedicate some time to planning the response and unpacking the prompt. So I'll give you some strategies around how to do that. They have to talk about, as I said earlier, to get that 7, they need to talk about the construction of the text, how the authors use various literary or filmic devices to build meaning within the text. So there'll be strategies about how to get students to refer to those, refer to that particular skill. They'll need to be familiar with the language used for analysis and analytical writing. Also, noting that they need to be discussing the relationships between the different pieces of information within their studied text, as opposed to just describing what's there or labeling what's there. Okay, so please have a read through this particular slide later. It will be up for you. So when we say analytical writing, what are we saying? What do we mean? And these, in my experience, these are the things that we want to target for students and to help them to write in this way. So body paragraphs need to adopt TEAL, or TEAL or TEAL. I guess depending on where your student's at is where you pitch their body paragraph. So students who, you know, are still at that consolidating level, I guess need to aim for TEAL, so their topic sentence, providing an example from the text, explaining what that example means, and then linking it back to the overall prompt and back to the topic sentence. TEAL is where you are starting to add some analysis. You're talking about the author's interpretation, you're talking about audience perceptions and interpretations as well. You're starting perhaps to use some meta language within the paragraph and explaining what all these elements of all these relationships between these pieces of information are and the overall message that they provide. TEAL is where you refer to two moments in a text, two examples from the text, and you expand on those. So I guess the more able students will be writing longer body paragraphs, and so they have time to be able to discuss two aspects of the topic sentence through two events in the text. So students need to know how to write topic and linking sentences, noting the difference between when they write about examples in an essay and when they provide explanation and elaboration of those, how to embed quotes, and how to just select a few versatile quotes. So maybe they need to memorize 10 to 15 quotes that are quite versatile, that work with various themes within the text, and how they then need to rephrase them, and not writing swathes of text as part of their quotes, just using sort of parts of sentences to embed. They are always using present tense. They avoid using general terms like thing or something. Sometimes it's difficult for students to remember the use of meta language. So even if they say a use of psi utilises the word or the phrase XYZ, that is starting to unpack meta language within their paragraphs. Nominalisation, passive voice, avoiding pronoun use, using modality like saying can or may in place of more definitive choices such as will, avoiding the use of phrasal verbs, play up, come out, avoiding slang of course, and avoiding contractions, trying to be concise as possible and precise with their vocabulary, and constantly referring to the author or the creator of the text and saying that this is their construction, these are their messages, and trying to also embed audience interpretations and reactions. And you can discuss, so we're studying at our school, I am Malala, so Western readers would view things in a different way to say a more conservative audience or a Pakistani audience, or feminist readers might interpret things differently. So all of these things combined, this is what analytical writing is, and the students need to be aware of this checklist and try and hit this as much as possible. So to break up preparing for section B, how do we revise content? How do we revise the writing skills? How do we get that analytical writing happening? And then how do we unpack prompts? And then finally, getting kids to write to time. So the rest of the presentation, which I think I have another 5 or 10, hopefully 10 more minutes discussing, is how to do these things and offering you some strategies. So I'll just skip to a Word document now. Please let me know if you can't see it, but how to revise content. With my classes, I tend to use revision grids, a strategy called Hot Seat, a lot of lists or lists and tables or mind maps. So to revise content, I usually centre it around the character. Students tend to really grasp characters and understand that. I find that a good entry point for students to recall events in texts. And then try and select 3 important events or moments that this character participated in the text. And ideally, their students are moving across the table and they are sort of connecting the information across the columns. So this character participated in this moment and displayed these qualities or this kind of characteristic. It represents this particular theme, and this was said during this moment. And then any filmic or literary devices that have been noted during this moment is also placed in this table. And then this column is a little different. What they do is they look at these moments. Ideally, they're in chronological order of the text. And how does the character changed or adopted a different attitude and so on. So if you can do that for every single character and the student can recall the content of the text quite well with this particular grid, find it quite useful. Hot seat is another character-based activity where each student becomes adopts a persona. Each student becomes someone in the text, and I give them a sticky label. They can stick it wherever they want, and once they are wearing that label, they are that particular person. So there's a chair in the middle of the room. The student in the hot seat sits in that, and I usually start with the main character, and all the other characters then are invited to ask questions of that main character and try to explore the motivations and explore the characters' viewpoints and perspectives and so on. Sometimes for our weaker students, the questions are difficult to generate. So I give them their character before this particular lesson. I'll ask them to think about it. I give them some question or sentence stems that they can try and use. And so they're prepared for this. And it really works for students who struggle with writing. I mean, students talking before writing is a very valuable, beneficial skill for students to adopt. Okay, next slide here, lists and tables. So these are theme-based, and I supply the theme of the text. So if you're studying Rear Window, voyeurism, I am Malala, personal growth, discrimination, so on. And the teacher generates these particular ideas that can belong to the theme. What the student then provides is they try to brainstorm events, evidence, examples, quotes, more meta language to support this particular idea. Then what I ask students to do is to generate topic sentences based on the theme and the connecting idea. So Hitchcock exposes voyeurism as a vehicle to blind one to reality, but they can try and come up with some topic sentences themselves with this guidance here. So this reviews how to generate topic sentences, this particular task. I'll talk more about topic sentences later in the analytical writing section of this presentation. And then mind maps are also really useful as well. Generally, they just represent the same information as in this list or table. It's just a different way to present information for our visual learners, and maybe it jogs their memory a little better having that visual graphic in their mind. So where the theme is centered in the middle, I often get students to work in groups, and they are dedicated a theme. Mixed ability groups in general, I give them the supporting ideas for that theme, and then it's their job then to sort of create the mind map, searching for quotes, events, examples, etc., that will support the theme and the idea that they generate. And again, they can generate topic sentences from a mind map by combining the theme and the idea together. So that's reviewing content. Now to review writing, I use other strategies, giving kids vocabulary lists to draw from, sentence stems to draw from, writing frames for essay components, and also giving them lots of essay samples to analyse. So back to the Word document here. So what kind of lists do I provide them with? Transition phrases, linking words, connectives, a lot of feeling and value vocabulary, trying to give them words that, high frequency verbs, words that replace show, I think elucidates, delineates, so on. And a lot of the definitions of the different literary and filmic devices that they will come across in texts. Here are some sentence stems for topic sentences. So the author, the director suggests X, Y, Z. This particular theme is. These sentence stems are helpful to students in terms of generating topic sentences, and you can combine this with, say, the previous activity and with the mind map or the table. And linking sentences are also important to provide stems for. Okay. These particular sentence stems allow students to start to analyse. So I can leave you to read these. The author depicts someone or something as X when X happens, or the author director uses a close-up shot of X to symbolise another feeling. So this is where that feeling vocabulary comes in handy. So what the students do is they mix and match from the lists and they put them all together and try to create topic sentences, linking sentences and analysis. Writing frames are very useful. Here is one that I use, and the students refer back to this as they're writing their essays. I connected this to Rear Window, but you could supplant your particular text that you're studying into this particular document, which is available to you at the end. This just tells them what's required, and also provides some more sentence stems within it to help them get that analysis going instead of just retelling. So yeah, that's how I revise writing with students. This particular activity I particularly like. I do this every year. Analyzing is where students highlight sections of the text and then they use that as a guide. So students are placed in groups of 5. They're given a sample essay, often an essay that's been written by a student, or one that's been adapted by a teacher into, I guess, sort of simpler terms. If we've got a lot of weaker students in our classes, we want them to be able to read a sample and understand its parts, and reduce that cognitive load, as opposed to using, teacher generated samples or study guide generated samples. Often I'm typing up samples and rephrasing them and providing them to the kids, or adapting the student ones to help the kids see what good writing looks like. And then with this activity, the students are asked to locate particular items and highlight them. So in groups of 5, each student is given a copy of the sample text response, and then there's one single copy that's provided to the group as a whole that I call the group copy. And group members number themselves off, and then each member is given a job to an aspect of the component of the essay to highlight. So every group member needs a different colour highlighter, and they assign themselves tasks. So student number 1 just needs to search for the text details in the introduction. needs to look for the elaboration, explanation sentences and audience interpretation sentences within the body paragraphs. And then in the conclusion, student number 1 needs to find the sentence that reviews the contention, and so on. Okay, so ideally, when the students have their own copy, they've highlighted the item that they're looking for. Then when the students come together and work as a group, they look at the group copy and they discuss before they highlight the group copy, because no one should be highlighting anyone else's section. And if 2 people want to highlight a section, a similar section, then someone's got something wrong. So then they have that discussion and they discuss amongst themselves as to why they should colour that section or they shouldn't colour that section. And then as a class, we come together and we read through the sample essay and explain what is correct, what colouring should have applied. So this is really useful if you want students to notice the different parts of an essay. Particularly useful when identifying meta-language and how it's unpacked. Okay, so back to the PowerPoint. Unpacking prompts, as we know from the advice, is very important. We need to unpack them, find synonyms for the keywords that are within the prompt, distinguish between the word types, so content words, modifying words, and instructional words, finding synonyms for these keywords, and making sure that the student rewrites the prompt in their own words. Once they've rewritten the prompt, they've understood the prompt, they start to ask questions of the prompt. And they can use the 5W and H strategy here. Well, when, where, why, how, who, and they ask questions of the prompt. I'll show you an example in a moment. With these questions that they've developed, they then categorise these questions. And then after they've categorised their questions, they brainstorm ideas and form topic sentences around those. They use the questions that they've developed as a springboard into topic sentences. And I like to do this activity collaboratively. While we've been remote learning, you know, through Google Docs or Microsoft Teams, I don't know which platforms you're using, but collaborative writing works well. It sort of brings everyone along, and then we move to individual attempts at unpacking prompts. So here is a prompt that we have unpacked together with my class. How does I, Malala, examine injustice? Here are the key words. The students come into the document, they find synonyms, and we all share our synonyms here. Distinguish between the word types. Then they start rephrasing the prompt in their own words, and we do this together as a class, so they're all typing away. Then, as I said, they question the prompt. So who initiates the cycle of injustice? Why do people perpetrate blatant injustice? And so on. And then we try to categorize these questions. So what we became aware of was that, you know, a lot of these pink questions are about, that they're all about causes. What is the cause of injustice? So they'll need a paragraph about the cause of injustice in their essay. Then we sort of keep going and look, yes, we need, what are the results of this injustice? What is how do characters respond to injustice, and so on. And we see we need a paragraph about the consequences of injustice. And then these green questions that we've categorized here ask for the message of use of say in relation to injustice. So through asking questions using the 5W and H strategy, and then categorizing these questions, often we find our structure of our essay. So causes, consequences, message, and then the students are asked to brainstorm ideas that relate to these categories. Ideas, events, meta-language items, quotes. Hopefully they can use their tables that they've been preparing from. They order their topic sentences, and then away they go. Hopefully they're ready to start writing. Finally, you have to get the kids writing to time. Now, some of our struggling students are going to find this difficult. They have to write in their essay. I think the mark allocation is 40, so within 3 hours, they have about 72 minutes to write an essay with an introduction, 3 body paragraphs and conclusion. So that's a tall order for some of our kids. So they need to start writing to time from now, I would suggest. And you can provide them with ideas, which is what I do in my classes, particularly for my students that will struggle. I give them tables of ideas, and then they have a time limit and they need to construct a body paragraph or an introduction from these dot points. And then they can start working towards independent construction once they start feeling more comfortable. So this is just an example of what I've done. I've told them what they should say in the introduction in dot points, what they could mention for each topic sentence. I've provided the topic sentence, the events, the key moments and events that they should discuss to relate to this particular topic sentence, and they can start writing to time with this as a scaffold. And then as they know the texts and become more familiar with the texts, they're then able to start doing this more independently and in hopefully a timed, in good time, in readiness for the exam. So if you have any questions, please let me know. That's the end of my presentation. Sorry if I went over a little too much.
Not at all, Stephanie. Thank you so much you covered just so much ground, and I've written down a lot of the different tips that you've given. So many resources that you're willing to share, which is so generous of you, and all those ideas around revision grids and hot seat and analyzing, just things that you can take away from a session and implement straight away. So thank you so much for that. I was also really impressed with how you differentiate those strategies depending on the students, and talking about the different approaches you take in that situation. So thank you so much for your presentation.
Welcome.
Okay, next up we have Maria, who's going to present on section C.
Let me just share mine. Okay, I think Steph needs to stop. Oh, hang on. Oh, hang on. All right, so I've got section C, which from the poll, people thought was the hardest section of the exam, and that's something that I agree with. So we've all got our work cut out for us with that section. So the exam overview, I think that's already been covered, but listening to texts is worth 20%. Section B, the analytical interpretation, is 40%. Section C, argument and persuasive language, which has 2 parts, that's worth 40% as well. All right, so this is taken from the VCAR study design. It just explains what's required in section C. Talks about how there will be there's 2 questions in section C. So question 1, students are required to demonstrate their understanding of an unseen text or unseen text by responding to short answer questions. And then question 2 is where they write their language and argument analysis essay, analysing how language and argument has been used to persuade others to share their point of view. So questions 1 and question 2 are equally weighted, even though lots of people, myself included, believe that question 1 is a lot easier than question 2, those short answer questions. All right, so this is from the exam report of last year. So just a little bit about high scoring responses. The fact that they're well written, demonstrate a strong understanding of the ways in which written and visual language and the use of argument are used through effective analysis of the material. There's an understanding of the context of the writing and the opinions expressed in the task material. Students are able to show the ability to integrate the analysis of the language and the argument. and to explore the implications of specific language choices. An analysis expressed with a range of precise vocabulary, and there's students are trying to link the visual and the words and explore how the writer's choices position the reader. For those of us who have been teaching EAL for a while, we know that previously to this study design, the other study design, the students only had to choose sort of 3 key points in the material and analyse those, whereas now the language analysis requires a more holistic analysis, which I will cover as part of this presentation. All right, so in terms of the short answer questions, just the revision activities, we need to ensure our students are familiar with the main question words like who, what, why, when, to what extent. I think Naomi covered a little bit of this in the listening presentation, but it's the same kind of thing. They're also needing to be aware of understanding the meanings of the direction words, like what's the difference between explain, describe, identify, list, summarise and support. So they need to know what those words mean so they're able to respond to the question or answer it in the way that they are expected to answer it. So the answers to the short answer questions need to be clear and concise. Students need to read the question carefully and answer accordingly. So again, it's the same as the listening, just concise answers that answer the question directly. There is no need to embed the question into the answer, so they just answer without putting the question in. They don't necessarily have to write in full sentences unless they are requested or told to write in full sentences. Same as the listening in terms of if a question asks them to identify 2 reasons, assessors will only look at the first 2 reasons that the students provide. So if they've written 4 reasons and the first answer is correct, the second answer is incorrect and the 2 last answers are correct, they're not going to get full marks because they haven't provided the 2 reasons, they've provided the 4 reasons. Same with the listening, students need to use the mark allocation as a guide for how much detail needs to be in the answer. And so if a question is only worth 1 mark, then they will know that there doesn't need to be too much detail in that answer. All right, so the mark allocation for question 2. This is again the VCAR criteria that VCAR uses to assess question 2. There is 2 assessors, so the actual task is worth 20 marks, but it's assessed twice and the students get a score out of 10. So this table tells us what they need to do to get the 5 and upwards. All right, so just with question 2, the importance of analytical writing. I think it was mentioned before in the text response presentation that they need to use an analytical structure. So for language analysis essays, they can use the ALEE or the TEAL structure or another similar structure. They need to focus on the use of analytical verbs that show what the writer or cartoonist is doing, and using those analytical verbs such as highlights, contends, criticises, attacks, condemns, praises, urges, reinforces, reveals, rejects, advocates, asserts. All of that language is specific precise analytical vocabulary that helps the kids get the high marks if they can pinpoint and use that sort of language. Then that is better than using language like states or says. Point 2, so as we mentioned with text response writing, the importance of trying to embed quotes from the text they are analysing into their writing. There's no need to provide large swathes of text, as Stephanie said also with the text response writing. A similar thing applies with the language analysis. So just choose short text, short quotes that they can easily embed into their writing. The use of meta language. So they can identify the techniques, but only as part of the analysis, or if it helps to build the analysis. It's not a case of them playing persuasive language bingo and identifying whatever techniques they can identify. And in fact, we need to be stressing to our students that the importance is not them identifying the techniques, but actually trying to be able to explain how the techniques are working to position audiences. This year in my Year 12 class, I have a student who just arrived from Hong Kong, so he hasn't done he didn't know anything about persuasive language, and he probably did better than a lot of the students with the language analysis because he could not identify the techniques because he didn't know what their names were, so he just had to rely on using his knowledge of what was being written to try and explain how the techniques were actually positioning the audience and what the writer was intending to do. So he did a lot better than a lot of the kids who just go straight to the persuasive technique, say what it is, and then, you know, just constantly do that again and again. And the other thing with the techniques, if they are going to use them, they need to make sure that the analysis of the techniques are precise, particularly with things like rhetorical questions or expert opinion. You often get kids falling into the trap of just giving the textbook definition of what a rhetorical question is or what expert opinion is. But what we need them to be able to do is to connect their analysis to the actual text that they are reading, so that the examiner knows that they understand the text that's being read. So just as with text response writing, we want to encourage formal language, no contractions to be used. Modal verbs or modalities, so may encourage readers to. Readers are encouraged to understand. Readers might do this. As much as possible, we need to sort of stop our students saying things like, this will persuade readers that, or this makes readers do this. So just, yes, stopping that, the use of that definitive language. And that's why use of words like encourage or criticises or other words helps them to refrain from doing that sort of stuff. Write in present tense or present continuous tense for variety. All right, so some revision activities for question 2. Vocabulary list, particularly of tone words. So the tone words that they have learnt for listening, they should also be able to use those words with helping them with their language analysis as well. Writing frames for introductions and body paragraphs. So no conclusion is needed for the language analysis essay in the exam. So at the end of the PowerPoint, I have embedded a list of tone words and a writing frame for introductions and body paragraphs. As I mentioned before, body paragraphs need to follow ALEE or some similar structure. So if you do ALEE, so argument, the students start off with identifying what the writer is arguing. The language, then they comment what persuasive strategies and or persuasive language is the writer using. Again, if it helps them, they can identify the techniques. If they can't identify the techniques, I tell the kids to just kind of give an example of the language and then just try and talk about how it's positioning the audience. So examples, giving examples using short quotations, and the effect is the most important. So how is the argument and language examples intended to position the audience to agree or to disagree or whatever? And students should be encouraged to identify a specific audience, as this will help them to make their analysis more precise. Especially in the exam, the text the students get for the exam, it is pretty easy for them to identify the specific audience, because that specific audience is usually explicitly stated in the background information, so they don't have to kind of sit there and try and work out who the audience is. Another useful strategy, which I think has already been mentioned, is analytical sentence stems, this time for analysing texts and visuals. So the same kind of analytical sentence stems that we give our students for analysing the in-text responses, we can sort of tinker with them a little bit so they can use them to analyse language analysis. Okay, another thing our students find very challenging is sometimes finding and tracking arguments, because this is a key component of this task. It's not just identifying language, it's being able to find and track the arguments. So this is a difficult skill for our weaker students. Some strategies: sometimes the arguments can hide at the top of paragraphs where new nouns are introduced or where there's mentions of people, places or groups. Sometimes connectives and conjunctions are also used to introduce new arguments. For stronger students who are able to comment on tone, sometimes shifts in tone also indicate there's a new argument. I think I mentioned at the beginning that students do not need to analyse everything. There's not enough time to analyse every single little bit in the text, so they need to basically be doing a holistic analysis. So looking at the start of the text, looking at the middle of the text, and then looking at the end of the text. If they are able to, they need to consider the structure of the piece. So they could be considering things like, how does the opening of the piece, how's it working to position audiences to be more likely to accept the recommendation made at the end of the piece. So some other revision activities, students need to be completing section C from previous exams. Insight practice exams and Blue Book practice exams, they also do have model section C responses that kids can do, but they're a little bit harder. So it's best to stick with the previous exams. They can also be annotating sample essays, or we can be doing that for them, looking at a medium and high samples. Sometimes low range samples can be useful as well, particularly in terms of the insight ones, because they're so deliberately low that they're useful to helping us to give the students confidence that they can actually do it, because usually most of the students are better than the low range samples that they give us to look at. So use student samples of work where possible rather than essays written by teachers, only because it can be demoralising for students to have a look at samples that are obviously written by teachers, because they're too good to even be student samples, let alone EAL student samples. So it's better to use student samples of work. Sometimes what I do, I do this for text response essays as well. I ask students to write paragraphs, and then I actually sort of put the paragraphs on a PowerPoint, then on one slide, I'll put the student paragraph, then I'll edit the paragraph and show them the improved paragraph so that they can see what they can do to improve their paragraphs. When I'm doing that, I always try and keep the student's voice in there and try and not change it too much. But I find that that is really helpful for kids because they see how they can improve their writing, and it's really good for the weaker kids to see also examples of medium or more stronger range pieces of writing. I've started doing that a lot this year because it's rather than just correcting the student work and giving it back to the individual student, I find that kids tend to learn a lot and they really appreciate it when they see good examples of student work or when they see their own work and how with just a couple of changes it can be improved a lot. So in terms of suggested time for the exam, I think that's already been covered, but we direct our students to complete section C after they complete section A, so after the listening section. In terms of section C, I think we say needing to spend 80 minutes on section C, 5 to 10 minutes reading and annotating the texts, spend 20 minutes on question 1, so that's usually the 5 short answer questions, and 45 minutes on question 2. So most students will be able to, even though the 2 parts are equally weighted, so question 1 and question 2 are worth the same, most students can finish question 1, the short answer questions, quickly. Then it gives them more time to spend on question 2. Just the last point, remind students to read the background information carefully, especially in the exam, because this explicitly introduces the context to the issue and often states who the target audience is. So that means the kids don't have to sit there and try and work it out for themselves. That was all. So there was also, as I said, I've got some tone words in the PowerPoint and also a document that explains how to, gives a suggested essay structure. The other thing I wanted to say was that even if they have 2 so the exam, even if it's 2 texts, they're not actually required to do a comparative paragraph. So it's not like the SAC. So last year when there were 2 texts, all they had to do was analyse 1 text and then they could do a little bit of a comparison as they introduced the second text. So they could say, in comparison, author X rebuts the arguments by doing this, this and that, and they adopt a more passionate or a more logical tone to argue this. Yeah, that was all. So very short.
Well, thank you so much, Maria. That was just an excellent presentation, and thanks for sharing your expertise. One thing I really took away from that was what you were talking about with the use of student samples. And I think the tendency as a teacher, and certainly my own practice, was always to, I'll write it, and then I've got a perfect model. But what you're saying is better for them to write it, and then if you need to just tinker with it a little bit, making sure that the voice is theirs the whole time. I think that's a really good approach and something to take away from the session. Thank you. We've now got time for a small amount of Q&A before we go into our breakout rooms. So maybe Stephanie and Naomi, if you can turn your videos and microphones on. So we had 3 questions during the presentations, which I'll run through now. If you have any other questions, you can put them in the chat function. We may not get to all of the questions, but we'll try our best. The first question was for you, Naomi, from Danielle. It was sort of a clarification question. She was asking, what was the key term to good to research? So what was the term to Google? Was it paralinguistics? And perhaps you want to talk a little bit about paralinguistics and how it relates to that task.
So I actually sent a private message to Danielle. It is
Okay.
paralanguage. So it can be just the language delivery if you like. I actually use a table that I purchased from TES, which is fantastic for the listening task, where it actually breaks down the different definitions for like pitch and pace, and any type of language and relationship terms as well. And I find that is fantastic. I laminate it for my kiddies, and this way they always have it.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Naomi. Stephanie, there's been a few comments about your mind maps, and people want to know what program you use to create them.
Well, yeah, I had a bit of trouble deciding because often these online sort of free mind maps, they change their conditions and you can't seem to be able to use them next time. So I started off with Poplet, which I thought was really good, Poplet, but then they make you pay things later. So you're only allowed to have one free mind map with them. That particular one that I showed you in the presentation is a Google extension called Coggle, Coggle. That one worked well this year. The EduStar suite with the Department of Education, if you belong to a public school, they had a program called Inspiration, which used to work quite well for me. But at my school, the kids only use Chromebooks and the Google suite. So we can't access that particular one. So there's a lot of variables that I think you would need to consider in your context to be able to select the best mind map option for you. What you're really though looking for, what I found in particular, is you want that note function. So when you've got your theme in the middle, the ideas around the edge, but you want the students to be able to write notes and write those quotes in and write those pieces of evidence and examples. So what you need to do is find a mind map with that note function that Coggle has. Wise mapping was another one. Now, if you look on the Word document, I have listed these there at the top for you to explore. Wise mapping was another one, but then that had a glitch when you wanted to share it with collaborators, because ideally you want the kids all sharing their ideas at the same time, working in the one mind map with you in there as well. So, and they all have their clunky points, but this year Coggle was the go. So Coggle.
Thanks, Stephanie. Another question for you from Linda. Do you think it would work to use students' Section B essays to analyse in groups?
Yes, student-generated samples. Is that what the questioner?
Yeah.
Yes, certainly. What I often do is kids, of course, write sample essays, that they draft them. You have a look at them. If I find a particularly good one, or one that's I can think, I often adapt, or I add to it, or I make some changes, and I offer that to the class as a good student sample. Or as Maria mentioned in her section of the presentation, you can make those adaptations in front of the students, where they can see you reworking a body paragraph or introduction or conclusion. So yeah, by all means, student samples are fabulous.
Sure. And one last question, Dominic asks, those lists, e.g. feelings that you mentioned, are you happy to share them?
Yes, okay. I can email that through to Dominic, or I can email that through to you, David, and you can put it up as part of another resource for the participants.
Yeah, perhaps email it to me, and then I can put it with the rest of the resources that you've shared.
No problem.
There's a few other questions there, and I see Naomi's been answering some of them. Thank you, Naomi. We are running out of time, so we might move to our breakout rooms now. So, so the breakout rooms will be in groups of about 5 people. In terms of discussion, we're sort of framing this in terms of strategies. So it's only 15 minutes. So perhaps it's a chance for you to share some of the best strategies that you found worked with your students, and what works well. Remember, when you go into the rooms, to unmute yourself and to turn your video on. Please start by introducing yourself and your institution as well. these breakout room part of the session will not be recorded. In a moment, you should receive a little pop-up which invites you to go to the breakout rooms. So we'll see you in about 15 minutes.